Welcome on But Here Developer channel. My name is Dima and I'm working on a big musician website. And today I'm going to talk about front-end documentation. I'm going to talk about Storybook. Storybook is a front-end workshop, front-end tools for working with user interface components or pages in isolation. And this description of Storybook is very humble. Storybook is a big ecosystem. It has included and maybe downloaded many add-ons, extensions that allow us to testing, displaying, demonstrate and work with our components isolated. In real life it looks like this. We have some categories or groups of our UI components with UI components in different state. We describe the state of the component ourselves. All separated state we call story, and file with multiple states we call stories. The states may depend on the input parameter of the component or property. State may depend on theme, state may depend on device screen extension, mobile, tablet, desktop, and etc. And of course it could depend on some input data, some mocked HTTP request, and etc. and etc. For example, we want to see what happens with component when user enters some long multi-line text, and it is incredibly useful. Just imagine that you should change some base component or some base CSS property. For example, change size of some base button. Using Storybook you can incredibly fast check all forms, all components that use your button and make sure that nothing is broken, or maybe something is broken, even without automation. You can manually check all states in all components. And of course we have search functionality. The developer can easily find the component he needs and use it in his work, and modify the component as needed. We documented it for entire team, and icing on the cake, you can use stories for testing your components. The same situation as on the backend side, where I recommend you to use Open API for testing. Frontend we can do the same. We can make one job, describe stories, and each story should be separated test parameters. In perfect world, story is equal to one test case. I'm going to talk and show testing in a separated video. Today talk only about Storybook. You can say I have been testing it for years without any storybooks and stories. Why I should spend my time for these tools? And maybe you are right. Maybe you are right if you have a small projects, or if we are talking about interface elements that are used everywhere, right on the main page, on layout, on login form, and etc. But in real life, these components, these elements tested multiple times. All regular use components were tested by your project manager, by you, by all your team, and etc. And you don't spend a lot of time for debugging them, but believe me, you will spend your time on a deep business logic functionality. Yeah, I'm talking about that form that you can see if you are user participating in a 1+1 promotion, and you can see this form only in Saturday, and only for users is in aquarium according to the horoscope. Of course I exaggerate, but not too much. In regular cases, what you should do, you should create specific user, make some specific environment, maybe call to backend developers and ask set some status for your user, and do these actions again and again until you fix the bug, and then repeat these actions for another type of users to make sure that you don't broke anything. But using Storybook you can make this action only once after all fixing, and yeah, you can spend 10 minutes to check other story to make sure that you don't broke anything or broke something. And here I have only one recommendation for you, because I very often see the teams that use Storybook as some UI kit only. They create stories only for base components, some inputs, some buttons, and etc. But much more useful to make story for all your components, for all forms, for all dialogues, and even for all pages. And yeah, it is very useful when you have Storybook pages in different states, with data, without data, in negative cases, for user with role admin, for user with role simple user, and etc. And if you're talking about work team, contender can start work without any blocks. If some API methods is not ready, you can just talk with backender and select some API format, or maybe write some open API documentation spec, and you as frontender can start working. You can mock data and make like pages, components, and etc. And the same when you work with Frontend team. You can start creating some components even without information where we going to use it. It could be form in model windows, form in some pages, and etc. You can simply create form and another developer can use it when they want. And here in a big team it is a very often situation when front-end team do not do anything before API was ready. But I should remember front-end is API user. So the situation when API are made under the front-end is more reliable. And yeah, I should say Swagger and Storybook will not save you from gap and conflicts between front-end and back-end teams. Sorry, but it is no single solution for all your problem. Using this technology we can only minify a gap between connection front-enders and back-end developers. And yes, of course, we use Storybook as front-end documentation. It is not only showcase, we can use Markdown X format or Markdown for writing component description, where we use this component, when, why we use this component, some description for states, and etc. And yeah, Markdown X allows us to import our component right inside Markdown document, so we can write a very beautiful documentation. So let's conclude. When we need Storybook, we need Storybook if we have a big project. It is necessary to have Storybook if we have A/B tests in our project. It is a very good situation when you have Storybook working with some external team, for example outsourcing. It allows you to switch team or make onboarding of new employee very fast. And of course if you really write test for your front ends. But unfortunately not everything is so perfect with Storybook, and I will go to the technical part right after I ask you to support Ukraine. Sorry, I am living in Ukraine, very close to fucking Russia. Russians try to kill me every day, try to kill my loved ones, try to kill everyone I know. I literally live and work under bombardment. And yeah, you can save my life. And yeah, it is not necessary to support Ukraine by your money. Believe me, you have a voice and that voice can change the world. At least it can change my world. Let your politicians know that you support Ukraine directly in social network or maybe on some real life, real meeting and etc. It could save my life, save life of my loved ones, and could save Ukraine and Europe. Thank you. Now let's talk about technical part of Storybook. And I will start with the biggest negative part of Storybook. Why Storybook is not a standard? Because Storybook has a very shitty, difficult setup. Let's clarify, I'm talking about Nuxt and Vue. And if I say that something could not be configured normally, it doesn't mean that it is not possible. It means only that I could not set up this in adequate time or in adequate resources. And yeah, it is second time when I set up a Vue project. First time was 3 years ago on Vue second version, and when I set up it, I think maybe it's because Vue 3 almost released and Storybook team or maybe all community do not spend time for setup for old technology or Vue 2. But now I try to set up on Nuxt and Vue 3, Nuxt 3, and have the same set of problems. This totally the same. To set up it I find almost 30 issues, but not in one GitHub repository, in different on repository from some Nuxt plugin, from some Storybook plugins, from Storybook, from Nuxt, from Vue, and etc. Really a lot of stupid work. And yes, Nuxt have extension, ready-made extension for easy integration with Storybook, but this extension don't work, from scratch don't work. And I really hope that this situation only for Vue developers, but I read some Reddit, some posts, and I see that many developers in many other frameworks have the same problem for initial setup. But after initial setup all work fine, and you will get all feature what I say in first part of this video. And yeah, you will get a problem only when you need to update for some major version of Storybook. So I don't want to burden you with a specific of setup for Vue or Nuxt.js. All setup code with description you can find by the link under the video. I just do a little tour of the setup. First of all, I install and use add-on for Nuxt, but not like Nuxt add-on separately. So I use two commands, npm run dev for run application and npm run storybook for run storybook, without using extension inside Nuxt DevTools. For normal work, I add an environment to run Storybook command and turn off some extensions, some Nuxt extensions from Nuxt config.js when run Storybook. And I turn off view runtime compiler. It's important settings. You can find many solutions when people recommend you to run a runtime compiler permanently, set true and forget about it. But you should not do it. It's make your Vue or Nuxt.js bundle much more bigger, and this probably don't give you some extra feature if you don't make applications like Storybook. Application when you have to compile Vue components on the move on the already running application. So please set runtime compiler true only for Storybook. And at that moment I have not been able to configure only one plugin, Nuxt fonts, but it is not so complex to set up fonts for your application from scratch. So no matter of what framework do you use, usually we have a directory point Storybook and two files, main and preview.js or TS, no matter. Inside main file we connect our add-ons, what we use, describe what add-on we use, describe what directory we should scan for finding our stories, and overwrite some write config. It is a solution from some set of bugs. A couple of words about add-ons. Add-on links essential and interaction are required, and default one. I use add-on themes for themes, for dark and light theme, and add-on accessibility for test accessibility of my components. I will talk about accessibility in a separated future video. And yes, Storybook has a lot of useful add-ons. You can run component test from Storybook, you can attach Figma design for Storybook, you can make visual testing, and etc, and etc. So yeah, I strongly recommend you to research Storybook add-ons. It could be very useful for you, and I'm going to use many add-ons in the future. So go to the preview.js file. Here we should store setup for our add-ons. Also here we configure all global story configurations. Default theme, default viewport, some decorator components, and etc. And here I commit bad solutions, what I think is a bad solutions, but I cannot continue work without it. Let me explain, please. When we first run our Storybook, all good. Storybook work fine without any problems. But if I load some story, go to another story and go back to first loaded story, already loaded, Vue instance in Storybook or Nuxt instance, forget all context, all global components, all global directives, all global functions, and etc. And yeah, if we use composition API, it's not so critical, but it's always localization module, it's always routing module, it's always some day.js functions for working with time, and etc, and etc. And I really want to find a better solution for this, but I cannot find it for adequate time, so I use recommended solution from community. Use stub or mocks or config, force config every global packages, components, and etc. So for now I first config localization module and Nuxt routing. In the future I believe it was day.js and maybe something else. But I really hope that community find a solution for this problem, and maybe it's my luck and I start setting up Storybook in a bad time, and we need a couple of weeks to fix all these issues. Okay, maybe you can misunderstood me. What's the problem with Storybook? Now for comfort work we should duplicate all config file, Nuxt config, white config, webpack config, and app configuration for Storybook. And it is a terrible information for your team, because when you use Nuxt, we got all from scratch. We just need one line to connect some add-ons, some extension. But with Storybook we should reconfig all add-ons, extension, all global features. And for the end, complaints about the Storybook. Storybook add-ons documentation terrible. Add-on can have some update, change all configuration, but documentation was the same. It is not so big problem problem, but you should be ready for this. Okay, go back to the code, but first I want to talk about directory structure, project structure, and I'm going to start with Nuxt. First of all, by default, Nuxt recommend you to store all your components, pages, and etc. in the root directory. It is very bad practice because we use search for navigation between project, and we totally don't want to search between node modules and caches. So I strongly recommend you to create subdirectory and isolate all your code inside this directory. And I use Nuxt with compatibility mode with version 4, and for version an IPP subdirectory is required. And second topic about Nuxt, by default Nuxt use directory structure as prefix for component name. For example, if you have component button inside directory base, a component name was base button. And as for me, it is very bad practice because it is very hard to refactor. If you want to make some subfolder, make some grouping of your components over and over, you should change all pages, all other components who use components in this group. It is very bad and required many resources for review. So I strongly recommend you to disable pass prefixes for Nuxt components. And yeah, I don't want to make another video about Nuxt structure, so let's talk about page directory structure. Nuxt use directory base structure for pages, and this is a very cool feature. This structure is necessary for better SEO optimization, for minimize mistakes what people do when create some specific routing with root conflicts and etc. And yeah, it is not perfect because we have a lot of files with the same name, index, ID, slug, but my practice and practice of community shows that there are more advantages in this approach. So why I'm talking about directory structure? By default, we should use directory for story, and for better development experience, we should duplicate directory, subdirectory structure inside stories, and in future inside tests directory. But in this approach, we had the same problem with refactor. If we change some directory, we should change it 3 times in stories, in tests, and in components. In real practice, when we talk about work in team, it's make a very big mess. So in this project, I try to isolate component, test, and story in directory closest to component in the same directory where we contain component. It should be much more useful, and it not make some effect to our build, production build. In contrast of backend, because in backend, in PHP backend, we should remove all test file from production build, and it is very easy to do when you have separated directory with tests. But we build our frontend, we build our storybook application, we build our main application, and test and stories files don't go to any production environment. So yeah, I'm going to test this approach, and I'm going to give you feedback in a future video. So go to the stories file. So define, contain, and export by default meta information. Meta information contains title. Title should be category and component name. Meta information should contain component for better working with types. And also inside meta block, we can describe all global parameters for this file. These parameters will have effect only for story in these files. And after describe meta information, we can describe each story separately. In very base case, we just send our properties or arguments inside args block. And of course, we can change parameters separately for each story. And here I want to talk about parameters and a little bit more about arguments, about props. If you use Storybook, Storybook will force you to write clear components. I'm talking about components when you manage component state only by properties. And this is a very positive approach. In perfect world, we all should write clear components. I know in real world it's not useful many times, but Storybook force you to write clear components because it's much more easy to write story. So you will get rid of unnecessary complexity. And this is a positive case. And if we talk about parameters, I strongly recommend you to write all your entity mocks inside separated directory, inside separated separated files with name mocks. It allows you to reuse your entities mocks inside multiple story, multiple test files, and of course it allows you to change some data. If, for example, backend say now this API return this format of data, you do change only in one files and can get update in all your stories. And of course test if all work fine or not. And yes, it's allowed to make your story very teeny. And yeah, there was a situation when writing story is very complex issue. For example, when you need to write some scoped parameters, or when your component is hidden and you should somehow show it. So we should create a wrapper, decorated component with adding some controls for better user experience in this story. Like in my example with side panel. But in real life, most of component story are really simple to write and they are really teeny, with very rare exceptions. And of course we can manage controls inside story. Almost all time story understand what controls they should display, some checkbox, some radio button or enum, but there is the cases when we should change type, make some limits or something else. And in real life it is easy to do, it is not big deal. So okay, it is all for today. If I forgot to describe something, you should know I'm going to talk about Storybook in video about testing, in video about accessibility and many other video. And I hope my video increase at least a little popularity to Storybook, and maybe in some day we're talking about Storybook as about standard of web development. So yeah, write clear components, support Ukraine, and thank you.